Hi everyone, welcome to the first video where we're really diving into the historical content of the class. Um, we're going to be doing a little bit of a review of the founding of the country, right? And we're going to review up until uh, the time period of the Civil War. It's mostly, that's what you learned in 8th grade. So we're just going to do like a quick recap of that. And then we'll start later with immigration and industrialization in the latter half of the 1800s. But for now, we're going to start with the uh, the colonies and kind of review that. So today we're going to be tackling Jamestown and Plymouth, which were the first permanent English colonies in North America. So now you have to understand that before the English arrived and before the English had established permanent colonies, that what would become the United States was teeming with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of American Indians. Everything that was going to be the United States, Central America, countries like Mexico and Guatemala, all the way down to Panama, Nicaragua, as well as South America. All those places were home to numerous tribes and several major civilizations who came from Asia hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years before Christopher Columbus came in 1492. Christopher Columbus, who was from a region that's part of Italy today, but was sailing under the Spanish flag, landed on Hispaniola, which is an island which today is composed of two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And when he landed there, he was looking for a shorter trade route to get to Asia, places like China and India. But he happened upon basically the Caribbean, which is considered to be part of the North American continent. So, because of his discovery, Spain quickly established an empire that would eventually stretch from South America to what is today the southwestern United States, places like Texas, New Mexico, Utah, and California. France was also doing a lot of exploring at this time, but they are much further north, up in what is today part of Canada, New England, all the way to the Great Lakes. And they would establish small settlements to trade with the American Indians and had a rather peaceful relationship with those natives. And with this map here, you can see the area in yellow, or yellowish orange, is how large the Spanish Empire was. They would conquer groups like the Aztecs and the remnants of the Mayans, the Mayan Empire, a lot of the larger tribes in the American Southwest. They would conquer, and then in the South American region, they would conquer the Inca tribe, which was the largest tribe or the largest civilization in that area. And you'll notice that for what is today Brazil, was controlled by the Portuguese, and that's why Brazilians today speak Portuguese. So it's important to remember the Spanish were in the Americas first, almost more than 100 years before the English were able to establish a permanent colony. But the English were attempting to establish various colonies. They had failed, but finally in 1607, they established one that lasts, and that's Jamestown, which is located in the Virginia Beach region, the Hampton Roads region of Southeast Virginia. It's not that far from Washington, D.C., and this was the first colony to last, and it was funded and maintained by what was called the Virginia Company. And this was a joint stock company that meant that investors could invest in the company. And they did this because they thought that they could get rich by getting gold and silver that they believed was going to be easily found in Virginia. But when the first colonists came over, they thought they'd find gold and silver, and they didn't. And instead of spending time that they should have been planting crops and developing good relationships with the natives for help and adjusting to the new climate, they basically, a lot of them died, unfortunately, because they hadn't done that and they were too busy looking for gold and silver. But soon something would happen that would it'd be an important turn of events that would work out to help them and to help Jamestown survive. But first, before we get to what that major event, let's take a look at these images here. So this is where Jamestown is located. You can see on this map where Washington, D.C. is in relation to Jamestown. So Jamestown in this area is the colonists founded, and they came up the James River into the bay and established the colony here. And we believe it would have looked something like this. Um, this fort where they would have established the colony. And you can go today to Jamestown and see what it kind of would have looked like. But even today, there are a lot of archaeological digs that take place there. So what saved Jamestown was tobacco. Yes, tobacco, the same thing you find in cigarettes, which you know isn't good for you. Tobacco saved Jamestown. Um, so the colonists discovered that tobacco grows really well in Virginia's soil. And so this saved the farms, and the farms ended up getting bigger, and more people are needed to work in the tobacco fields. And so in order to get more people from England to come to the colony, something called the headright system was put into place. So anyone who paid for their own or someone else's passage to Virginia would receive 50 acres of land in return. And then they could grow tobacco on it and potentially make a lot of money doing that. You also had indentured servants. Now, these were people who were really poor, really in desperate situations in England, and they would agree to go work on a plantation for a set number of years in Jamestown or in the Virginia area in exchange for somebody in Virginia paying for their passage to North America. So there are a lot of folks who took that, who saw this as a way out of whatever troubles they were experiencing in England. And then in 1619, the first African slaves were brought to English North America. First in Spanish Florida, which had been settled for a long time, many decades before the English established Jamestown. They had slaves down in Spanish Florida. But the first African slaves to come to an English colony arrived in 1619. Here's a field of tobacco. So this is what the plant kind of looks like, an artist's interpretation. It looks pretty similar to that in real life. And this plant gets turned into what's put in cigarettes. So with all these people coming into Virginia, they needed to establish a form of self-government, because for day-to-day things going on, they couldn't wait for the king or queen or parliament over in England to make decisions for them. So in 1619, they established what was called the House of Burgesses, and this was the first representative body in Virginia. So it represented white male landowners, basically the rich in Virginia, and they would choose members of their class, their upper class, to go and meet at the House of Burgesses and make government decisions for them. So even though it was limited in its representation, it was still an example of how the colonists began to govern themselves independently of the English king and parliament. Now, you can actually go visit the House of Burgesses today, or where they would have met, which is in Williamsburg, Virginia. So this is a picture of what it looks like now. This is really cool. I didn't get to see this building, but I did get to go to Jamestown and see it. I got to go to Charlottesville and Williamsburg, but I don't have any pictures of the House of Burgesses. I probably did go in it, but yeah, the whole area on the East Coast, I went to DC. It's all really cool to see all this stuff preserved. You definitely should one day go and visit. It's really cool. So there's also a system called primogeniture in England that pushed a lot of people to the Virginia colony. And what this meant was that the firstborn son of a family that had money would inherit all the family's wealth and land. But that meant that any other sons really wouldn't get anything, and they were left to fend for themselves. And any daughters would be expected to go and marry into another family and become part of that other family, and they would be supported by them. So many of these sons who expected no inheritance, right, because of the primogeniture system, they ended up heading to Virginia to make their own fortunes and try to make a name for themselves. But many of them struggled to adjust. A lot of them never had really worked a day in their lives, and they never really worked on a farm. So they really struggled to do the day-to-day things you had to do to survive in Virginia. They just weren't used to the hard work, and they also tended to get less desirable land. Land where you couldn't really grow a lot of crops to support yourself and feed your families. And this led to a lot of clashes with American Indians because the American Indians could grow crops, could do what it took to survive on this land. And so you had English colonists starting conflicts with natives because they would try to take what the natives had, and it led to a lot of battles and eventual wars with the Native Americans. So this is something that's going to continue, obviously, for many years in American history. You could say these clashes were kind of like those that go on in fantasy stories like Game of Thrones. Although uh, these fantasy stories, like the ones in Game of Thrones, they're all too often based on things that really happen in our own lives. This like fight for power and fight for control. So there now there are more conflicts than just with the natives. There are also conflicts uh, amongst the English within Jamestown. First of all, you had wealthy landowners who controlled the House of Burgesses and made policies that favored them, like laws and taxes. So if you're wealthy, you got to keep more of your money, and most of the taxes fell upon the low classes. Uh, well, this led to conflicts like Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, and this was led by a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. He was the son of a wealthy Englishman because of his primogeniture. He headed to Jamestown because even though he was actually, I believe, the oldest son, he wasn't going to get anything from his father. And so he headed to Jamestown. He wasn't really happy with the land he got, didn't think the government was doing enough for the poor people. He also he didn't like the Native Americans, and he started some conflicts with them. And so he eventually raised an army to fight the natives and turned to fight the wealthiest colonists also. He ultimately burned Jamestown down, but he died just a couple months later from illness, and his rebellion basically fell apart um, once he died. Still, even though his rebellion wasn't completely successful, his complaints about taxes and the abuse of power by the government would turn up in a big way about 100 years later when all of the American colonies would unite to fight a rebellion against England, known as, you should know, the American Revolution. So here's a drawing. This picture is a drawing of Bacon's Rebellion, what it might have looked like when they went into Jamestown and burned it to the ground. We don't actually know what they would have looked like, so this is one artist's interpretation, right? So let's turn our attention north to the second permanent colony in what would become the United States, and this was Plymouth. Plymouth colony, this is up in New England. And so in 1620, you had a group of religious people known as Puritans, who we call today, um, who we nicknamed Pilgrims. They set sail for Virginia, and they were called Pilgrims because they were the first to kind of blaze this trail for their religious organization. Um, this group they were specifically known as separatists. They had different beliefs about Christianity than most of the English, and they wanted to get away from and separate themselves from the beliefs of the Church of England and go practice their own religion, where nobody uh, could bother them. And we know that nobody was going to bother them in New England, right? So they headed out this way, a small group of Puritans, to pave the way for others. They were originally heading for Virginia, though, but they landed way off course in what they called New England. They got blown off course by a storm, and when they landed, or they just got off the coast line, they realized they weren't in Virginia, and so they established what was known as Plymouth Colony. So this was the second permanent English settlement in North America. Now, this is what a pilgrim or a Puritan would have looked like. Notice he had quite a uniform there. Imagine if you got to wear that one day, one every day now. And here's what the women would have worn. So take a look and see how that compares to what you have to wear to school or what you wear out today at the mall or whatever. So the Puritans realized that they were not in Virginia, and so they decided that they had to come to an agreement about how they were going to rule themselves, how they were going to govern themselves, how they were going to make decisions in this new land. So they developed what was known as the Mayflower Compact. And it's called the Mayflower Compact because that was the ship um, the Mayflower that they arrived on. And this simple document created a civil government to create an equal laws for the general good of the colony. Basically, they wouldn't make any decisions unless there was enough support for it. Not one person. It wasn't going to just be one person making decisions for everybody. They had to be approved by a majority of the male settlers. Um, they still pledged loyalty to the Kingdom of England, right? They were going to govern themselves day to day, but they still considered themselves loyal to the King of England. And here's the actual uh, Mayflower Compact, what it looked like. It was written on a simple piece of paper on the Mayflower boat. Uh, so New England continued to grow. The Jamestown settlement took off really, and the Plymouth settlement took off. They had more Puritans who followed them, and thousands of families followed for religious and economic reasons. They could practice their religion freely, and they could succeed up there in growing crops and starting practicing businesses. And they established something called the Massachusetts Bay Colony or Company, which was a joint stock company. And it had the same business model that founded Jamestown back in 1607. So people could invest in the company and potentially make money off of what was grown in the colony and the other businesses that were started in Massachusetts Bay. And it was formed in 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is basically a good chunk of what is Massachusetts today. The capital was Boston, one of the most well-known cities and oldest cities in the United States. And here is a map. It's kind of, it's really blurry actually, but this is basically what it would have looked like. So you can see we have Rhode Island over here. This is Massachusetts Bay, and this was the Plymouth colony, right? And you see New York is like further south down here. So how did they govern themselves in New England? Let's talk about that. Um, they had an independent government that was loyal to the king, but all adult male Puritans who they called themselves freedmen, they could vote for members of what they called the General Court. So this was their lawmaking group, like the House of Burgesses down in Virginia. So government officials, they had to be Puritans. Not everybody in New England was a Puritan, but if you wanted to participate in the government and in many places wanted to vote, you had to be a white male Puritan. Laws were also based on Puritan beliefs. They had religious foundations. So for instance, there was a law that required people to go to church. And so if you weren't Puritan, you still had to conform to a lot of these laws, or else you'd pay a fine or potentially be executed or expelled for your beliefs, often banished. And some of the earliest colonies that would eventually become the United States were founded by people who were banished. Now, as the colony grew, just like in Virginia, conflicts with the American Indians in New England also increased and led to many bloody wars. And there were conflicts among the colonists as well. One big example is the Salem witch trials, where colonists were accusing each other of becoming witches, and many people died. Now, this is a quote from one of their leaders, John Winthrop, which you should take a moment to read, explaining his vision for New England. And so that's our lesson for today. We'll continue on with the rest of the review of the founding of the United States in our upcoming lessons. So let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.